A millionaire's Lamborghini broke down in the middle of nowhere until a homeless man said he was an ex-mechanic. What happened next changed everything forever. Edward Halbrook had it all: wealth, power, a supercar that cost more than most people's homes. But when his Lamborghini died on a lonely highway at dusk, rain pouring down, his perfect world suddenly felt very small. No cell signal, no help in sight. Just him, stranded in the darkness. Then, from the shadows of an abandoned gas station, a scruffy homeless man emerged with his loyal dog. Edward's first instinct? This guy wants money. But instead, the stranger said something that stopped him cold. "I used to be a mechanic. Want me to take a look?" This wasn't just any homeless man. Sam Carter had secrets, skills that could save a Lamborghini, wisdom that could humble a millionaire, and a past so tragic it would shatter Edward's cold heart. As Sam's weathered hands worked magic under the hood, Edward had no idea he was about to discover the most expensive lesson of his life. Because sometimes, the person you least expect to help you is exactly the person you need most. And sometimes, fixing a car is really about fixing a soul. But here's the question that will haunt you. When a millionaire realizes he's the one who's truly broken, can a homeless man's compassion rebuild what greed destroyed? Or will Edward's world collapse before he learns what really matters? If stories like this give you hope that kindness still exists, hit that subscribe button, because we all need reminders that humanity can surprise us. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching this incredible story unfold? The first drops of rain struck Edward Halbrook's windshield like a warning he should have heeded. The Lamborghini Huracan, his metallic silver testament to success, had been purring flawlessly through the California hills just moments before. Now it coughed, sputtered, and died with the finality of a judge's gavel, leaving him stranded on a desolate stretch of Highway 46 as dusk painted the sky in shades of regret. "Come on, you piece of—" Edward's curse died in his throat as he turned the key again. Nothing. Not even the dignified rumble that had cost him $200,000. The engine bay held the silence of expensive failure. He pulled his phone from the breast pocket of his tailored suit, the screen's glow revealing what he already suspected: one bar, flickering like a dying candle. No signal meant no rescue, no tow truck, no quick fix to return him to his climate-controlled world of boardrooms and bottom lines. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the carbon fiber roof with increasing urgency. Edward had built an empire by never accepting defeat, but the highway didn't care about his net worth. The nearest town lay 30 miles behind him, and ahead stretched nothing but asphalt disappearing into the gathering darkness. He stepped out into the drizzle, his Italian leather shoes meeting wet pavement with the soft sound of expensive regret. That's when he saw the movement across the road. From the shadows of what had once been a Texaco station, now just weathered concrete and broken dreams, a figure emerged. The man was perhaps 50, with a grizzled beard and clothes that had seen too many seasons. A medium-sized mutt with intelligent brown eyes padded beside him, both moving with the careful economy of those who had learned to make every step count. Edward's hand instinctively moved to his wallet. He'd played this game before in city streets: the approach, the sob story, the extended palm. But something in the stranger's bearing made him pause. The man wasn't hurrying toward him with the eager desperation Edward expected. Instead, he crossed the road with measured steps, his weathered face holding neither hope nor calculation, just quiet observation. "Car trouble?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying the roughened edges of someone who'd spent too many nights under open sky. "Obviously," Edward replied, then caught himself. The rain was making him irritable, and this man, whatever his story, hadn't asked for anything yet. "Sorry, yes, it just died." The stranger nodded, approaching the Lamborghini with the same careful respect one might show a sleeping animal. His dog, a loyal-looking mix of breeds that probably included some German Shepherd, settled onto its haunches nearby, watching Edward with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "I'm Sam," the man said, running a calloused hand along the car's sleek flank. "This is Diesel," he gestured to the dog, who responded with a subtle tail wag. I used to be a mechanic. Want me to take a look?" The offer hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Edward studied Sam's face, searching for the angle, the hustle, the inevitable request for money. Instead, he found only patience and something that looked remarkably like competence. The man's hands, though scarred and weathered, moved over the car's surface with the confidence of someone who understood machines in ways that transcended appearance. "This isn't some rusty pickup, old man," Edward heard himself say. "It's a Lamborghini Huracan, V10 engine, 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. You probably couldn't afford the insurance to look at it." Sam's expression didn't change. He simply waited, rain darkening his worn jacket, while Diesel shifted slightly closer to Edward's legs, as if sensing tension that needed diffusing. Sam absorbed Edward's insult like rain on dry earth, completely, without resistance. He knelt beside the Lamborghini's front end, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Diesel padded over and lay down beside him, resting his chin on his paws as if this were a familiar ritual. The dog's brown eyes tracked Edward's every movement, alert but non-threatening. "May I?" Sam asked, his fingers already positioned near the hood release, waiting for permission that Edward grudgingly gave with a sharp nod. The hood lifted with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing the engineering marvel beneath. Edward expected Sam to recoil, overwhelmed by the complexity of German precision and Italian artistry. Instead, the homeless man leaned forward with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a patient. His scarred hands hovered over the engine bay, never touching, just observing. "Timing's off," Sam murmured, more to himself than to Edward. "And there's a fuel delivery issue. See how the lines are sitting? That connection's loose." He pointed to a spot Edward couldn't even identify. "When's the last time you had the fuel filter changed?" Edward blinked. "The what?" "Fuel filter. Should be every 15,000 miles on a car like this, maybe 20 if you're lucky." Sam's voice held no judgment, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating the obvious. "Luxury cars need more care, not less. The tolerances are tighter." The rain intensified, creating a drumbeat on the car's metal surfaces. Edward found himself studying Sam's face as the man continued his diagnosis. There was something unsettling about the confidence in those weathered features, the way his eyes moved over the engine with intimate familiarity. This wasn't the stumbling uncertainty Edward had expected from a homeless man trying to impress his way to a handout. Diesel suddenly stood and walked over to Edward, pressing his warm flank against the man's leg. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely kind, that Edward felt something tighten in his chest. When was the last time another living being had approached him without wanting something? "He likes you," Sam observed, reaching into the engine bay to manipulate something Edward couldn't see. "Diesel's usually skittish around strangers. You must have good energy." Edward almost laughed at the absurdity. Good energy? He'd fired 3 employees just this morning for missing their quarterly targets. His assistant had quit last week, citing his impossible standards. His own mother hadn't called him in 6 months because, as she'd put it, talking to him had become exhausting. Sam's hands worked with surprising dexterity, using what appeared to be a piece of wire from his pocket to secure something near the fuel line. The intimacy with which he touched the expensive machinery was almost reverent, like a pianist caressing keys after years away from music. Edward's phone buzzed. The display showed Veronica's name, his business partner, probably calling about the Henderson acquisition. The deal that could net them $40 million, but would require shuttering 3 manufacturing plants. 700 jobs gone, but the quarterly numbers would sing. "Edward Halbrook," he answered, stepping away from the car. "Where the hell are you?" Veronica's voice crackled through the weak connection. "Henderson's people want an answer on the plant closures tonight. We need to move on this before they change their minds." Edward glanced back at Sam, who was now reaching deeper into the engine bay, his entire focus consumed by the mechanical puzzle before him. Diesel had returned to his master's side but kept glancing back at Edward, as if sensing the tension crackling through the phone line. "I'm dealing with something," Edward said, watching Sam work with tools that seemed to materialize from thin air. "Deal with it later." This is 40 million we're talking about. Sign off on the closures and let's lock this down. Give me 20 minutes, Edward said into the phone, his eyes fixed on Sam's methodical work. The homeless man had produced a small flashlight from somewhere in his layered clothing, its beam revealing the intricate maze of the Lamborghini's engine bay. His movements were precise, economical, the work of someone who had spent decades translating mechanical problems into solutions. 20 minutes for what? Veronica's voice sharpened. Edward, Henderson's team is waiting. We're talking about 700 jobs versus 40 million in profit. The math is simple. Edward ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, turning the abandoned gas station's parking lot into a mirror of fractured reflections. He watched Sam work in silence, noting the way the man's scarred hands moved with surgical precision despite their weathered appearance. "You seem to know your way around engines," Edward said, the understatement feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. Sam didn't look up from his work. 23 years running my own shop. His voice held no bitterness, just fact delivered as plainly as a weather report. Started when I was 19, worked my way up from changing oil to rebuilding racing engines. What happened? Edward found himself asking, though he immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. He didn't do personal, especially not with strangers, especially not with homeless strangers on dark highways. Sam's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their careful manipulation of cables and connections. "Life's not always a straight road," he said quietly. "Sometimes you lose the map." Diesel lifted his head, studying Edward with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog seemed to sense the shift in conversation, the way it had moved from mechanical to something more fragile. Edward felt exposed under that canine gaze, as if Diesel could see through the expensive suit to the hollow space beneath. "That's pretty philosophical for a mechanic," Edward said, then immediately wished he could recall the condescending tone. Something about this situation, the rain, the isolation, Sam's unexpected competence, was stripping away his usual armor. "Philosophy's just life experience dressed up in fancy words," Sam replied. He straightened slightly, wiping his hands on a cloth that had appeared from another pocket. "Try starting her now." Edward climbed back into the Lamborghini's driver's seat, the leather still warm despite the cooling air. The key turned, and the engine caught immediately, not the smooth purr he was accustomed to, but a rough idle that at least promised forward motion. "She'll get you where you need to go," Sam said, lowering the hood with careful precision. "But you'll want to get that fuel system properly serviced soon." "And Edward?" Sam's use of his name startled him. When had he even introduced himself? "Sometimes the right fix isn't the easy one." Edward's phone buzzed again. Veronica, no doubt growing impatient with the Henderson deal. 700 jobs hanging in the balance, while he sat in a broken-down supercar getting advice from a homeless philosopher. The absurdity should have been laughable, but instead it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the ground beneath his feet was solid or already crumbling. He looked at Sam through the rain-streaked windshield. This man who had materialized from the shadows to solve his immediate problem while somehow creating a dozen larger ones in Edward's mind. Diesel sat beside his master, both figures patient and still, waiting to see what choice Edward would make next. The engine coughed but held steady, and Edward realized that for the first time in years he had no idea what he was supposed to do. Edward rolled down the passenger window, rainwater immediately speckling the leather interior he'd paid extra to protect. "Get in," he said, the words emerging before his rational mind could intercept them. "Both of you." Sam tilted his head slightly, studying Edward's face in the glow of the dashboard lights. "That's not necessary. We're fine walking." "In this rain? Don't be ridiculous." Edward heard the sharp edge in his own voice and tried to soften it. "It's the least I can do. Where are you headed?" "Anywhere with 4 walls and a roof." Sam's honesty was disarming. He opened the passenger door with the careful reverence of someone who understood the value of things he couldn't afford to replace. Diesel bounded into the back seat, his wet fur immediately filling the car with the earthy scent of rain and loyalty. Edward wrinkled his nose but said nothing. The dog settled behind him, and within moments Edward felt a warm weight against his shoulder as Diesel rested his head there with the casual intimacy of an old friend. The gesture was so unexpected, so trusting, that Edward found himself holding his breath. "Sorry," Sam said, glancing back at his companion. "He's not usually so forward." "It's fine," Edward lied, though something in his chest was doing strange things he couldn't name. When was the last time anything had touched him without wanting something in return? As they drove through the rain-slicked darkness, Edward found himself stealing glances at his passenger. Sam sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching the landscape roll past with the patient attention of someone who had learned to find interest in the most mundane details. There was a stillness about him that Edward envied, a kind of peace that money couldn't purchase. "So what's your story?" Edward asked, immediately regretting how the question sounded like an interview. "I mean, you said you owned a shop. 23 years is a long time to walk away from." Sam was quiet for so long that Edward began to think he wouldn't answer. Diesel shifted behind them, his breathing creating a gentle rhythm in the confined space. Finally, Sam spoke, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Had a shop in Riverside. Nothing fancy, just honest work for honest people. My wife Sarah used to do the books, handle the customers, while I stayed under the hoods." His fingers traced patterns on the window glass. "She got sick, cancer. The kind that takes everything you have and asks for more." Edward's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd heard variations of this story before: medical bankruptcies, families destroyed by illness and debt. He'd always dismissed them as excuses, failures of personal responsibility. But hearing it from Sam, seeing the quiet dignity with which he carried his loss, made it feel different, real. "The shop went first," Sam continued, "then the house, then Sarah." He paused, and Edward heard him swallow hard. "Pride kept me from asking for help. Thought I could rebuild, start over. But grief has its own timeline, and the world doesn't wait." Diesel's weight against Edward's shoulder seemed to grow heavier, more substantial. The dog's presence felt like a bridge between two men who had nothing in common except this moment, this confession in a moving confessional of steel and glass. Edward's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Veronica again. The Henderson deal. 700 jobs that needed to be sacrificed for $40 million in profit. Numbers on a spreadsheet, he'd always told himself. Just business decisions that had to be made. "What would you do?" Edward asked suddenly. "If you had another chance, another shop." Sam smiled for the first time since Edward had met him. "Same thing I always did, fix what's broken." The all-night diner appeared through the rain like a lighthouse, its neon sign casting wavering reflections across the wet asphalt. Edward pulled into the parking lot, surprised by his own reluctance to end this strange interlude. Diesel lifted his head from Edward's shoulder, alert and interested in their new surroundings. Inside, the diner held the comfortable shabbiness of a place that had served coffee and comfort to travelers for decades. A middle-aged waitress with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, approached their booth. Her name tag read, "Dinah." "Coffee to start?" she asked, already reaching for the pot without waiting for an answer. Her gaze took in Sam's weathered appearance, and Diesel, who had positioned himself loyally beside the booth, without a flicker of judgment. "Please," Sam said. "And maybe a bowl of water for my friend here?" Dinah smiled. "Of course, honey. What else can I get you both?" Edward ordered without looking at the menu. Eggs Benedict, because it was what he always ordered, what was expected of a man in his position. Sam asked for coffee and toast, nothing more, despite Edward's insistence that he order whatever he wanted. "I'm not a charity case," Sam said quietly after Dinah had left. "I work for what I keep." The words stung more than they should have. Edward found himself studying Sam's face in the fluorescent lighting, noting the lines that spoke of both hardship and laughter, the eyes that held no resentment despite having lost everything. "If you had another chance," Edward pressed, returning to their earlier conversation, "what would you do differently?" Sam considered the question while Dinah refilled their cups. "Same thing I always loved, fixing what's broken. Doesn't matter if it's cars or people, everything can be repaired if you're patient enough and use the right tools. Edward's phone erupted in buzzing urgency. Veronica's name flashed on the screen alongside a text. Henderson team leaving in 30 minutes. Sign the authorization now or we lose everything. The weight of decision pressed against his chest. $40 million. His investors would celebrate. The board would approve his next acquisition. His bank account would grow by another 8 figures. All it required was his signature on a document that would scatter 700 families like leaves in a storm. He looked at Sam, who was watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. "Business emergency," Edward said, pulling up the authorization form on his phone. His thumb hovered over the electronic signature pad. "Sometimes the right fix isn't the easy one," Sam had said earlier. The words echoed in the diner's fluorescent hum, mixing with the sound of Diesel's gentle breathing and the distant clatter of dishes being washed. Edward thought about those 700 jobs, families with mortgages and car payments, and children who needed school clothes. People who worked with their hands, who built things, who understood the satisfaction of honest labor. People like Sam had been, before life stripped away everything except his dignity and his dog. His thumb moved across the screen. The authorization went through with a soft electronic chime that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of his conscience. Sam said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, not judgment, exactly, but a quiet recognition of a choice made. Diesel's tail, which had been wagging softly against the floor, went still. Edward stared at his phone's blank screen, waiting for the satisfaction of another successful deal to flood through him. Instead, he felt only the hollow ache of a man who had just realized he was the thing most in need of repair. "What have I done?" he whispered, more to himself than to Sam. But Sam heard. He always seemed to hear the things that mattered most. Edward woke the next morning to his penthouse apartment flooded with sunlight and the harsh glare of his own choices. The news played on the wall-mounted television, volume low but insistent, as he moved through his morning routine of espresso and stock reports. He'd slept poorly, haunted by images of Diesel's trusting eyes and Sam's quiet dignity, but daylight had a way of making highway confessions seem like temporary madness. Then the anchor's voice cut through his rationalization like a blade. "Breaking news this morning. Halbrook Industries announced the closure of 3 manufacturing facilities, eliminating over 700 jobs in what CEO Edward Halbrook called necessary restructuring for competitive positioning. Workers arrived at the plants this morning to find security guards and termination notices." The coffee cup slipped from Edward's hand, shattering against the marble floor. On screen, his corporate headshot appeared beside footage of workers gathering outside the shuttered plants. Faces he'd never seen but had destroyed with a casual swipe of his thumb. A woman in her 50s clutched a termination letter, tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke to a reporter. 22 years I gave this company," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how I'm going to tell my kids." Edward reached for the remote, but the images kept coming. A middle-aged man loading tools into his truck, his shoulders bent with defeat. Young workers standing in the parking lot, still wearing their safety vests, looking lost and bewildered. Children would go without birthday parties. Mortgages would default. Dreams would die because Edward Halbrook needed another $40 million. His phone rang constantly. Reporters, investors, board members, offering congratulations on the bold move. Each call felt like another nail in the coffin of whatever soul he'd once possessed. He stopped answering after the 5th reporter asked him to comment on being called a heartless corporate executioner by the union representative. By noon, protesters had gathered outside his corporate headquarters. By evening, they'd found his residential building. From his 40th floor window, Edward could see them holding signs with his photo crossed out in red. "Corporate criminal," one sign read. "Blood money Halbrook," declared another. He'd built his wealth by making hard choices, by refusing to let emotion cloud business judgment. But now, staring down at those angry faces in the street, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. It burned in his chest like acid, eating through the carefully constructed justifications he'd built around his life. The memory of Sam's words echoed in the silence of his expensive tomb. Sometimes the right fix isn't the easy one. Edward had taken the easy fix, the profitable fix, the fix that made the numbers sing while human voices fell silent. He thought of Diesel's warm weight against his shoulder, the dog's instinctive trust in someone who had just proven himself unworthy of it. He thought of Sam's scarred hands working with reverent precision on the Lamborghini, fixing what was broken without asking for anything in return except the satisfaction of honest work. Edward's reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows, ghostly and insubstantial against the city lights. For the first time in his adult life, he saw himself clearly. Not a successful businessman making tough choices, but a hollow man who had traded his humanity for numbers on a balance sheet. He picked up his keys and headed for the elevator. He needed to find a homeless man and his dog, and somehow learn what it meant to fix the things that truly mattered. Edward found Sam under the Morrison Street Bridge, exactly where desperation and instinct had led him to search. The homeless man sat on a piece of cardboard, his back against a concrete pillar, with Diesel curled beside him in the gathering dusk. Neither seemed surprised to see the millionaire climbing down the embankment in his $1,000 shoes, navigating the debris of lives that society had forgotten. "I made the wrong call," Edward said without preamble, his voice echoing off the concrete above them. The admission felt like tearing something vital from his chest. Sam looked up from the paperback book he'd been reading by the light of a small camping lantern. 700 families, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. You saw the news. Hard to miss. Your face has been on every screen in the city. Sam closed the book, something about motorcycle repair, and set it carefully aside. How do you feel? The question was so simple, so direct, that Edward almost laughed. How did he feel? Like a fraud. Like a coward. Like a man who had spent so many years chasing success that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. Empty, Edward said finally. I thought it would feel different. The money, the deal, the victory. But it just feels empty. Diesel lifted his head and studied Edward with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, as if he sensed something different in the man who had once shared the back seat of a Lamborghini with him. Sam reached over and scratched behind Diesel's ears, his scarred fingers moving with the gentle precision Edward had first noticed under the car's hood. Empty's not the worst thing to feel, Sam said. Empty means there's room for something better. Edward pulled out his phone and showed Sam a series of real estate listings he'd been scrolling through during his drive across the city. I own properties I'd forgotten about, investments that just sit there collecting dust while I collect rent. He swiped to a particular listing, a former auto shop in a working-class neighborhood, complete with hydraulic lifts and tool bays. This one's been empty for 3 years. Sam leaned forward, studying the screen with the focused attention he'd given to the Lamborghini's engine. Henderson's old place, he said with recognition. Good bones. Charlie Henderson ran an honest shop there for 30 years before his son made him sell. It's yours, Edward said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. On one condition. Sam's eyebrows rose, and for the first time since Edward had met him, the homeless man looked genuinely surprised. Diesel sat up straighter, sensing the shift in energy between the two humans. What condition? Edward felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long he'd forgotten it existed. You teach me what you know. About fixing things, about doing work that matters, about being the kind of man who deserves a dog's trust. Sam was quiet for a long moment, looking from Edward to the phone screen and back again. Around them, the city hummed with evening traffic and distant sirens, the soundtrack of lives being lived while others were discarded. Finally, Sam extended his hand, calloused, scarred, honest. Deal, he said. As Edward shook that weathered hand, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Hope. Not the calculated optimism of a business opportunity, but the raw, fragile hope of a man who had glimpsed the possibility of redemption. Diesel's tail wagged harder, as if he approved of whatever bargain had just been struck in the shadows beneath the bridge.